The first time Claire touched my hand, my wife was standing 3 feet away from us. That was what made it unforgettable. Not the touch itself. It barely lasted 2 seconds. Her fingers only rested on mine while she handed me a plate at the kitchen counter during Thanksgiving dinner. Anybody else would have missed it completely. But I felt the pressure. Deliberate, lingering, wrong. And when I looked up, Claire smiled at me in a way no sister-in-law should ever smile at a married man. Especially not her husband's older brother. Especially not in my house. My wife, Helen, was pouring wine for our guests, laughing too loudly at something my youngest son said. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and butter and burned sugar from the pie cooling near the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass over the sink. It should have felt warm. Instead, something cold settled behind my ribs. Claire tilted her head slightly before walking away. Calm, casual. Like she'd done nothing unusual. Maybe she thought I would enjoy it. Most men probably would have. Claire was 38 then. Beautiful in the polished, expensive way some women become after learning exactly what effect they have on a room. She dressed carefully even for family dinners. Silk blouses, gold bracelets, perfume that lingered after she left. My younger brother Daniel worshipped her. That was the tragedy of it. He still looked at her the way exhausted men look at miracles. I remember standing there holding that plate while everyone laughed in the dining room, realizing something uncomfortable. Claire had been watching me for a long time. And suddenly, I began remembering moments I had ignored. The unnecessary hugs, the late-night texts about family problems, the way she always sat beside me during holidays instead of beside Daniel, the way her voice softened when we were alone. At 59, you start recognizing certain patterns faster. Age sharpens some instincts while dulling others. You stop believing coincidences repeat themselves that often. Still, I said nothing. Men like me spend most of our lives saying nothing. That's how families survive as long as they do. I carried the turkey into the dining room and sat at the head of the table beneath the old brass clock Helen bought 20 years earlier from an antique shop outside Milwaukee. The thing ticked louder every winter for some reason. Nobody else seemed to notice it. I always did. Daniel was talking about layoffs at his construction company. My oldest son, Eric, barely looked up from his phone while pretending to listen. Helen kept interrupting people halfway through sentences like she always did whenever she wanted attention redirected toward herself. And Claire kept watching me. Not constantly. That would have made it easier. No, she watched me carefully. In fragments. Quick glances across wine glasses and candlelight. The kind designed to create doubt inside the person receiving them. The worst manipulations are the ones that can still be denied. After dinner, Helen asked me to fix the loose hinge on the downstairs bathroom door. Of course she did. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only long-married men understand. The moment your usefulness quietly replaces your presence. Nobody asks how you're feeling anymore. They ask whether you can repair something. I went downstairs to the garage workshop where I kept my tools lined neatly along the wall beside an old radio that only picked up 2 stations properly anymore. My father's wristwatch sat beside a box of screws near the workbench. The watch hadn't worked in 11 years. I still wound it every Sunday. Some habits become memorials. I found the screwdriver I needed and heard footsteps on the basement stairs behind me. Soft. Slow. Not Helen's. Claire appeared near the bottom step, wearing that cream-colored sweater she knew looked elegant under warm light. "He disappeared," she said quietly. I came to fix the hinge. You're always fixing something. I nodded once. She walked farther into the workshop, looking around with strange curiosity, like she was studying a room that explained me better than words ever could. Helen hated the workshop, said it smelled like dust and old wood. But it was the only room in the house where nobody demanded anything from me. Claire touched the edge of the workbench lightly. Daniel says you practically raised him after your father died. He exaggerates. No, she said. I don't think he does. There was something dangerous about the softness in her voice. I focused on organizing screws that didn't need organizing. You should go upstairs, I told her. Why? People will talk. Claire laughed under her breath. About what? I finally looked at her then. And there it was again. That look. Not playful anymore. Hungry. It embarrassed me more than it flattered me. You're married to my brother, I said. And you're married to a woman who stopped seeing you years ago. The sentence landed harder than it should have, because part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong. That's the thing manipulative people understand best. Truth becomes far more dangerous when mixed carefully with cruelty. I tightened my grip around the screwdriver. You should go upstairs. Instead of leaving, Claire stepped closer. Close enough for me to smell her perfume beneath the scent of sawdust and machine oil. I think you're lonely, she said softly. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because I suddenly understood something deeply unpleasant. This wasn't spontaneous. She had been building toward this moment for a long time, carefully, patiently, like someone testing a locked door over and over until the hinges weakened. You're mistaken, I told her. No, she whispered. I don't think I am. Then she touched my chest lightly, just once. A small gesture, but intimate enough to poison the room. I stepped backward immediately. Her expression changed, only slightly, but I saw it. Surprise. Not because I moved away, because she genuinely believed I wouldn't. That disturbed me more than anything else. You need to stop this, I said. Claire folded her arms slowly. You really are loyal, aren't you? I made vows. That doesn't mean she deserves you. I stared at her for several seconds before answering. Deserving has nothing to do with it. People think fidelity is about love. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's the quiet pride of enduring things nobody applauds. I stayed faithful to Helen because I gave her 32 years of my life. At some point, betrayal starts feeling less like freedom and more like setting fire to your own history. Claire studied me carefully, then smiled again, but differently this time. Colder, more interested, as if rejection itself had made me valuable. That was when the real fear finally arrived. Not fear that I would sleep with her, fear that she would not stop trying. Upstairs, everyone laughed suddenly at something Daniel said. The sound drifted faintly into the basement. A happy family, warm lights, full stomachs, polite smiles. And beneath all of it, something rotten quietly breathing between the walls. Claire moved toward the stairs, but paused beside me first. You know, she said calmly, most men would have wanted me to stay. Then she walked upstairs without looking back. I stood alone in the workshop, listening to the old brass clock ticking faintly through the ceiling. Tick, tick, tick. And for the first time in years, I had the strange feeling that my family was beginning to split open somewhere deep beneath the surface. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, The way foundations crack under houses before anyone notices the floor tilting. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text message from Claire. I opened it expecting an apology. Instead, I saw a photograph. My stomach turned cold instantly, because the picture was me, standing in the garage moments earlier, taken without my knowledge. And beneath it, she wrote only 6 words. No one would believe you refused. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. In the end, I didn't. That probably frustrated her more than anger would have. People like Claire survive through emotional reactions: shock, panic, desire, guilt. Any response gives them something to shape. Silence leaves them alone with themselves, and manipulative people rarely enjoy their own company for very long. Still, my hand felt strangely numb holding the phone. No one would believe you refused. 6 words. Careful words. Not emotional. Not reckless. Strategic. That was what unsettled me most. I deleted the message immediately, but the damage remained anyway. Some things linger in the body after the evidence disappears, like smoke inside old curtains. Upstairs, dinner was ending. I could hear chairs scraping hardwood floors, Helen laughing again, Daniel asking if anyone wanted coffee. Normal sounds. That was the terrifying part. Disaster almost never announces itself properly at first. It hides inside ordinary evenings. I fixed the hinge slower than necessary, just to stay downstairs a few extra minutes. My hands moved automatically while my thoughts circled somewhere darker. I kept thinking about the photograph, the angle, the timing. Claire must have taken it while I turned toward the workbench, which meant she came downstairs prepared. Prepared for rejection. Prepared for leverage. A terrible realization settled quietly into place. This wasn't attraction anymore. This was power. By the time I returned upstairs, Helen was stacking dessert plates in the kitchen, while Claire stood beside the coffee maker, pouring cream into mugs. Neither woman looked at me immediately, but Claire smiled faintly into her cup, just enough for me to notice. I felt suddenly exhausted. Age changes the way fear works inside a man. When you're young, fear feels sharp and immediate. Fights, accidents, sudden loss. At my age, fear becomes slower, more patient. You begin fearing situations instead of moments, consequences instead of pain. I spent most of the evening avoiding being alone with her again. Daniel eventually opened another bottle of wine while Eric complained about mortgage rates and rising daycare costs. My youngest son, Nathan, barely spoke at all. He mostly sat near the far end of the table, scrolling through sports scores on his phone between conversations. Sometimes I wondered when silence became hereditary in our family. Near 10 o'clock, people started gathering coats. Helen hugged Claire tightly near the front door. "You need to come by next weekend," my wife said. "We never see enough of you two anymore." Claire glanced at me while buttoning her coat. "I'm sure Robert's tired of seeing me already." Nobody noticed the sentence except me. That's another thing age teaches you. Dangerous people often speak in 2 conversations at once. Daniel clapped my shoulder before leaving. "Thanks again for dinner, big brother." I nodded. Then Claire hugged me. I tried keeping it brief. She didn't. Her hand rested lightly against my back while her mouth moved close to my ear. "You deleted the message too quickly," she whispered. Then she pulled away, smiling, and left. I stood in the doorway watching rain fall across the driveway while Daniel helped her into the passenger seat. He looked tired, older than 50 should look. There are men who spend entire marriages trying to earn love from women already bored with them. Daniel had become one of those men years ago. I don't think he realized it yet. Helen closed the door behind them and started cleaning immediately. She always cleaned aggressively after guests left, like hospitality itself irritated her once applause disappeared. "You barely spoke tonight," she said without looking at me. I was tired. "You're always tired lately." I almost laughed. Most long marriages eventually become conversations between two people discussing symptoms instead of feelings. I helped clear the dishes in silence. After 32 years together, Helen and I moved around each other with the efficiency of coworkers finishing a late shift. No tenderness. No cruelty either. Just routine. Routine can resemble peace from far away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows, while Helen breathed beside me under the dim blue light of the digital alarm clock. 2:14 a.m. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways a man's life can collapse without him touching another woman. That's what people misunderstand about reputation. Truth matters far less than timing. A single accusation arriving at the wrong moment can infect decades of loyalty overnight, especially for men, especially older men. I got out of bed quietly and walked downstairs. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. Familiar sounds, familiar darkness. In the kitchen, I poured myself water and stood near the sink, watching rain slide down the backyard windows. The reflection staring back at me looked older lately. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone carrying conversations he couldn't share with anyone. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Claire. This time there was no photograph, only a sentence. "You should have let yourself be wanted for once." I closed my eyes. Not because the message tempted me, because part of me understood exactly where she intended to strike. Loneliness. That invisible hunger people stop acknowledging after a certain age. Older men become useful instead of desired, necessary instead of seen, providers, problem solvers, quiet financial scaffolding holding everyone else comfortably above collapse. After enough years, even good men begin wondering whether anyone would notice if they disappeared emotionally before they disappeared physically. Claire understood that. Predators usually do. I typed carefully, "Do not contact me like this again." 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, "You're scared of me?" "No," I wrote back. "I'm disappointed in you." That one took longer. Several minutes passed before her response arrived. "You think you're different from other men because you hide it better." I stared at the sentence, then locked the phone and set it face down on the counter. That was when I understood the true danger. Claire didn't just want attention. She needed corruption. Some people become deeply uncomfortable around integrity because it reminds them of what they traded away inside themselves years earlier. She wanted proof that all men eventually break, and my refusal had transformed me from temptation into challenge. I should have told Daniel immediately. That would have been the smart thing, the honest thing. But families are strange ecosystems. Once poison enters them, nobody predicts correctly where it spreads first. Daniel loved her blindly. Helen disliked conflict more than dishonesty. My sons had grown up in a world where men were usually assumed guilty first and heard second. And Claire already had evidence prepared. A photograph, private messages, fragments without context. I suddenly imagined trying to explain everything aloud and hearing how pathetic it sounded. My sister-in-law keeps trying to seduce me. At 59 years old, the sentence itself felt absurd, humiliating. Men are expected to survive these situations quietly. If we complain, people laugh. If we defend ourselves too strongly, people grow suspicious. If we remain silent, dangerous people keep escalating. That's the trap. I stayed in the kitchen until almost 4 in the morning. The old brass clock ticked steadily from the dining room wall. Tick, tick, tick. A sound I used to find comforting. Now it sounded like countdown. The next morning, Helen barely looked up from her coffee before speaking. Daniel called. I felt my chest tighten instantly. What about? He said Claire forgot her bracelet here last night. I said nothing. Helen stirred cream into her mug lazily. She's coming by this afternoon to pick it up. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows like something trying to escape the house. And somewhere deep inside my stomach, an old instinct whispered the same warning men often ignore right before their lives begin unraveling. This wasn't over. It hadn't even really started yet. Claire arrived at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I had been watching the clock for nearly an hour already. Helen was upstairs folding laundry. Nathan had borrowed my truck earlier that morning to help a friend move furniture across town. The house felt unusually hollow, carrying that quiet stillness homes sometimes develop before storms. I almost considered leaving before she arrived. Not out of fear, out of instinct. Animals leave places that smell dangerous long before humans do. But this was my house. And somewhere deep inside me still existed an old-fashioned belief that if a man behaved correctly long enough, eventually the situation around him would correct itself too. Age teaches you otherwise. Claire knocked lightly before letting herself in. She wore a dark green coat and carried no purse. That detail bothered me immediately. People usually carry things when they expect to leave quickly. Your bracelet's on the kitchen counter, I said before she could speak. She closed the front door slowly behind her. Daniel's at work, she said. I didn't ask. A small smile touched her mouth. You always sound irritated now. I stayed near the dining room entrance while she walked toward the kitchen. The old brass clock ticked steadily above us. Afternoon light spilled pale and gray across the hardwood floors. Claire picked up the bracelet but didn't put it on. Instead, she leaned lightly against the counter. You didn't sleep much, she observed. I said nothing. You have those shadows under your eyes again. What do you want, Claire? The directness surprised her slightly. Manipulative people prefer emotional fog. It gives them room to move. She rolled the bracelet slowly between her fingers. You know what's strange? She asked softly. Most men spend their whole lives terrified nobody wants them anymore. But you act like being wanted is some kind of insult. I looked toward the window. Rain clouds gathered heavily beyond the backyard fence. You're confusing loneliness with permission. That sounds rehearsed. No, I said quietly. It sounds old. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she walked toward me slowly. Not seductively this time. Carefully, like someone approaching an injured animal. I think you've been unhappy for years, she said. The sentence landed deeper than I expected. Because there are truths you only allow yourself to hear accidentally. I glanced toward the staircase, suddenly aware Helen was still upstairs. She's my wife. Claire nodded calmly. But she stopped loving you a long time ago. The cruelty of the statement wasn't in whether it was true, it was how casually she used it. Like a locksmith testing keys inside damaged doors. You should leave, I told her. Instead, she studied the family photograph hanging near the dining room archway. It had been taken 12 years earlier at a lake house in Michigan. Everyone smiling, arms around shoulders, sunlight reflecting off water behind us. A perfect family. Or at least a talented imitation of one. You look different there, Claire said quietly. I was younger. No, she replied. You still believed people needed you. That one hurt. Not because she was right, because I realized she had spent years observing all the invisible fractures inside this family while everyone else remained distracted by routine. Predatory people notice emotional weaknesses, the way gamblers notice desperation at poker tables. You should really leave now, I repeated. Claire turned toward me fully. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Has Helen ever touched you first? I felt something cold move through my chest. Not anger, recognition. This wasn't flirtation anymore. It was excavation. She wanted me emotionally exposed. The dangerous thing about loneliness is how badly exhausted people want to feel understood. Even briefly. Even by the wrong person. Especially by the wrong person. I thought about Helen upstairs folding laundry while barely remembering the shape of my inner life anymore. 32 years together. And somehow the distance between us had grown so gradually neither of us noticed until conversation itself became maintenance. I looked at Claire carefully. You enjoy this, don't you? What? Finding weak places in people. For the first time since this began, her smile disappeared completely. That told me more than words could have. You think I'm some kind of villain, she said quietly. I think you're unhappy. Something shifted behind her eyes then. Sharp, wounded, dangerous. My father stopped speaking to my mother when I was 11, she said suddenly. They lived in the same house for 17 years, barely looking at each other. You know what that teaches a little girl? I stayed silent. It teaches her love disappears long before people admit it. The room grew very still. Outside, wind brushed softly against tree branches. Claire stepped closer again. But you still look at people, she whispered. That's the problem. I understood then. This had never been entirely about sex. It was validation, recognition. She wanted to feel visible to someone emotionally disciplined enough to withhold himself from everyone else. Broken people often become obsessed with the affection they cannot naturally earn. You need help I can't give you, I said. Her jaw tightened slightly. You really believe you're morally superior, don't you? No, I answered. I just know damage when I see it. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then came footsteps upstairs, Helen descending slowly. Claire immediately stepped backward, and just like that, her entire posture changed. The softness vanished. The vulnerability vanished. By the time Helen entered the kitchen carrying folded towels, Claire looked perfectly composed again. Found it? Helen asked. Claire smiled warmly. Right where Robert said. Helen glanced between us briefly. Something flickered across her face too quickly to read. Suspicion, maybe. Or intuition. Long marriages sharpen certain instincts while destroying others. "You staying for coffee?" Helen asked. Claire looked directly at me before answering. "If I stay longer, I might become a burden." Then she kissed Helen lightly on the cheek and walked toward the front door. But before leaving, she paused beside me one final time. Not touching, not smiling, just close enough to speak softly without Helen hearing. "You think silence protects people," she murmured. Then she left. The front door closed gently behind her. A moment later, Helen began placing towels into kitchen drawers. Neither of us spoke immediately. I could feel tension lingering invisibly in the room like static before lightning. Finally, Helen asked, without looking at me, "Did something happen between you two?" My stomach tightened. There it was, the moment. Small, quiet, potentially life-changing. I could tell the truth, right there, right then. But people underestimate how difficult honesty becomes once consequences acquire faces. I pictured Daniel, my sons, family gatherings exploding apart, accusations, humiliation, doubt, and worst of all, the possibility Helen might believe Claire over me. After decades of marriage, that possibility should have felt impossible. It didn't, because distance changes trust slowly, quietly, like rust inside pipes. I chose my next words carefully. "No," I said. Helen nodded once, still not looking at me. Then she opened another drawer and spoke so softly I almost missed it. "She looks at you strangely sometimes." The sentence settled heavily between us. Not accusation, not jealousy, observation. And suddenly I realized something deeply unsettling. Helen had noticed long before I did. Maybe longer, maybe for years. But instead of confronting it, she had done what families always do with uncomfortable truths. She placed it silently on a shelf and kept living around it. Then the phone rang upstairs. Helen went to answer it. I remained alone in the kitchen, staring at the rain-darkened window above the sink. And for the first time, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if Claire wasn't the only person in this family hiding something from me? Helen stayed upstairs on the phone for nearly 40 minutes. I knew because I listened to the old brass clock count every minute of it. Tick, tick, tick. There are silences inside marriages that begin feeling territorial after enough years. Private conversations behind closed doors, lowered voices, small emotional withdrawals nobody acknowledges directly. When Helen finally came downstairs, she looked distracted. Not guilty, just elsewhere. "That was Marianne," she said casually, reaching for her coffee mug. "Her husband's back in the hospital." I nodded. Marianne had been Helen's closest friend since their 30s. Her husband, Carl, had suffered 2 strokes over the past 3 years. Half their conversations now revolved around medications, specialists, insurance forms, and the humiliating logistics of aging bodies. It frightened Helen more than she admitted. Watching other people decline always does. "What did the doctor say?" I asked. "They don't know yet." Then she looked at me carefully. "You sure everything's okay?" There it was again. Not suspicion exactly. Instinct. People who spend decades beside each other develop strange emotional radar. Not accurate enough to reveal truth, just accurate enough to detect disturbance. "I'm fine," I said. She studied me for another second before turning away. Neither of us believed me. That evening passed quietly. Too quietly. Nathan returned my truck around 6 and barely stayed long enough to eat dinner. Eric texted asking if I could loan him money again, just until next month. Helen spent most of the evening watching television without really paying attention to it. And I kept thinking about Claire's final sentence. You think silence protects people. The problem with manipulative people is that sometimes they accidentally tell the truth while trying to wound you. Silence had protected this family for years. Protected Helen from embarrassment. Protected my sons from consequences. Protected Daniel from realities he wasn't strong enough to face. Protected me from admitting how lonely my own life had become. Families survive through selective blindness more often than love. That night, around 11, Helen fell asleep on the couch with the television still glowing softly across the room. I covered her with the old knitted blanket her mother made before dementia hollowed her memory apart, piece by piece. Helen stirred slightly, but didn't wake. I stood there looking at her for a long moment. Age changes attraction in ways younger people never understand. Passion fades gradually, yes, but something sadder replaces it sometimes. Familiarity without intimacy. You become archivists of each other instead of partners. I still knew how Helen took her coffee, which medications upset her stomach, which knee hurt more during winter rain. But I no longer knew what she feared at 3 a.m, or whether she ever thought about leaving. That realization sat heavier than I expected. Upstairs, I showered slowly and changed into sweatpants before noticing Helen's phone vibrating softly on the nightstand downstairs. She never left her phone behind. Ever. The screen lit briefly in the dark living room. One new message. I should have ignored it. A decent man probably would have. But exhaustion changes moral boundaries in subtle ways. And once doubt enters a marriage, curiosity starts masquerading as self-defense. I looked. The message preview read only, "I told you he noticed." No name attached, no context, but my stomach tightened instantly. Because something about the sentence felt wrong. Too familiar. I stared at the glowing screen while rain tapped faintly against the windows again. Then another message appeared. She asked questions after I left. My pulse slowed strangely. Not faster. Slower. The way it does right before bad news arrives. I unlocked the phone. Helen still used our anniversary as her passcode. Some habits survive emotional distance. The messages were from Claire. A long thread stretched upward across the screen. Weeks of conversation. My mouth went dry. I scrolled carefully. At first, the messages seemed harmless. Complaints about Daniel, family gossip, jokes about holidays. Then gradually something darker emerged beneath the surface. Claire describing me, observing me, analyzing me. He watches everyone before he answers. I don't think he's happy anymore. He notices things other men miss. And Helen responding. Not encouraging her exactly, but not stopping her either. That hurt more. People often imagine betrayal as dramatic moments, affairs, lies, explosions. But some betrayals happen quietly, through permission, through allowing dangerous things to continue because confrontation feels inconvenient. I kept scrolling. Then I found the message that truly unsettled me. Claire, do you think he suspects anything? Helen, Robert suspects everything. He just pretends not to. The room suddenly felt colder. I read the sentence 3 times, not because I misunderstood it, because I realized Helen understood me better than I thought she did, and still chose distance anyway. Further down, another exchange waited. Claire, sometimes I think he's the only decent man left in this family. Helen, you can admire him without turning it into something unhealthy. My chest tightened. So Helen knew, at least partially. Maybe not the messages, maybe not the photographs, but enough. Enough to warn her, enough to recognize danger. And still she said nothing to me. I sat slowly in the recliner near the darkened television while the phone glowed faintly in my hands. There's a particular grief that comes from realizing your pain has been visible all along. Not hidden, not misunderstood, simply tolerated. I continued reading. Claire. She says he barely touches her anymore. Helen. That's private. Claire. You avoided denying it. Several minutes passed between the next responses. Then Helen wrote, "Marriage changes people." That one nearly broke my heart. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded surrendered. Like someone slowly lowering themselves into cold water after deciding resistance no longer mattered. I suddenly saw our marriage differently. Not loveless. Worse. Depleted. Like two exhausted people preserving structure after emotional meaning had quietly leaked away over decades. Then I reached the newest messages. The ones from today. Claire. I almost told him. Helen. Don't. Claire. He looked at me like I was broken. Helen. You pushed too hard again. Again. The word echoed inside my head. Again. Not once, not recently. Again. I stared at the message thread while realization spread slowly through me like poison entering bloodstream. Helen knew this had happened before. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to call it again. Enough to warn her privately instead of protecting me openly. Enough to leave me standing alone inside something she had quietly monitored from the sidelines. Footsteps creaked upstairs. Helen waking. I locked the phone immediately and placed it back exactly where I found it. Then I sat motionless in the recliner while the television flickered silently across the room. Helen descended a minute later wearing her robe, hair slightly disheveled from sleep. You okay? She asked softly. I looked at her. Really looked at her. 32 years together. Funerals. Births. Dead. Layoffs. Hospital rooms. Shared grief. Shared exhaustion. And suddenly I realized something devastating. You can spend decades beside someone and still never fully know which of your sufferings they considered acceptable. I couldn't sleep, I answered. Helen nodded slowly. Then she noticed her phone on the table. For one brief second, something flickered across her face. Tiny, almost invisible. Fear. Not fear of being caught cheating. Fear of being known. She picked up the phone casually. You should come back to bed. I almost told her everything right there. About Claire, about the messages, about the photograph. But another realization stopped me cold. If Helen already knew more than she admitted, then this family had been quietly rearranging itself around hidden truths for much longer than I understood. And I no longer knew who was protecting whom anymore. I started paying attention differently after that. Not emotionally. Systematically. There's a stage of disappointment older men eventually reach where feelings become less useful than observation. You stop asking whether something hurts and begin asking why it exists at all. For the next 2 weeks, I watched my family carefully. Not obsessively, quietly. The same way a man studies cracks in a ceiling after hearing strange noises in the walls. And once I started noticing things, I couldn't stop. Helen guarded her phone now. Not dramatically, just enough. Turning the screen slightly away during messages, taking calls in other rooms, sleeping with it face down beside the bed. Tiny behaviors. But marriage teaches you the difference between habit and adjustment. Claire continued texting me occasionally despite my silence. Nothing explicit anymore. That almost made it worse. Hope your knee feels better after the rain. You looked tired at dinner Sunday. Helen forgets you like cinnamon in your coffee. Little intimacies. The kind that slowly create emotional trespassing. I never responded. But I didn't block her either. Part of me wanted evidence. Another part wanted to understand how far this had already spread before I noticed. That second reason frightened me more. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel came over unexpectedly while Helen was grocery shopping. He looked exhausted. His beard had more gray in it lately. "You busy?" he asked. "Not particularly." He nodded toward the backyard. "Mind if we sit outside?" The October air carried that dry coldness that arrives before winter fully commits itself. Leaves scraped softly across the deck while we sat beneath the covered patio beside the old propane heater I still hadn't repaired properly. Daniel rubbed both hands together slowly. "You ever feel like you're becoming invisible inside your own house?" The question caught me off guard. I stayed quiet. He laughed bitterly. "Guess that's a yes." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back in the chair, staring toward the fence. "Claire says I've changed," he murmured. "Says I'm emotionally unavailable now." The irony nearly hollowed me out. I wondered if he had any idea how carefully she studied emotional weaknesses in other people while creating them herself. "You work too much," I said carefully. "So did you." "That's different." "Why?" "Because I worked to hold things together. You work because you're terrified of what happens if you stop." But I didn't say that aloud. Daniel sighed heavily. "She used to look at me like I mattered." There it was. The sentence men rarely admit until middle age finally crushes pride enough to drag honesty out of them. I remembered Claire saying almost the exact opposite about me. "You still look at people." The realization disturbed me deeply. She wasn't seducing randomly. She targeted emotional starvation. And suddenly, I began wondering how many times she had done this, before learning how to hide it so well. "She still loves you," I said. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounded rehearsed. I almost laughed at the echo. Wind rattled dead leaves along the deck. Then Daniel asked quietly, "Can I ask you something without you giving me the older brother version?" "Depends." He hesitated. "Did marriage ever make you feel replaceable?" The question landed hard because nobody asks older men things like that honestly. People assume fathers exist beyond emotional needs, like responsibility somehow sterilizes loneliness. I looked out across the yard before answering. "There's a point in long marriages," I said slowly, "where people stop seeing each other as human beings and start seeing each other as routines." Daniel nodded immediately, too quickly, like he'd been waiting for someone else to say it first. "She barely touches me anymore," he admitted. I felt something twist painfully inside my chest. Not because of the confession itself, because Claire had already used almost identical words about Helen and me. She was feeding on the same wound in both brothers simultaneously. That realization made her seem suddenly colder, more methodical. She says intimacy feels forced now, Daniel continued quietly. Like another obligation. I looked at my younger brother carefully, at the tired posture, the defeated eyes, the man slowly shrinking inside his own marriage without understanding why. And for one terrible moment, I saw myself 15 years earlier. That's the cruelest thing about aging. You begin recognizing old versions of yourself walking around inside people you love. Sometimes, Daniel said softly, I think she only stays because leaving would cost too much. I almost told him then. God help me, I almost did. But fear isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's awareness. Once spoken, certain truths become uncontrollable things. And I still didn't fully understand Claire's intentions yet, or Helen's role in any of it, or how badly this family might fracture if I pulled the wrong thread too soon. So instead, I asked carefully, Have you two been fighting? Daniel laughed quietly. That's the problem. We barely fight anymore. The sentence hung between us heavily. People think the death of marriage sounds loud. Usually it sounds tired. He stood a few minutes later and stretched slowly. You ever regret it? He asked suddenly. Regret what? Building your whole life around people. I looked toward the kitchen window where Helen moved faintly inside the house, unpacking groceries. 32 years. Sacrifices nobody remembered anymore because survival makes old rescues invisible. Children who called when they needed money more often than conversation. A wife who still depended on me while quietly drifting somewhere emotionally unreachable. And now Claire. Like some final cruel joke arriving late in life. Regret is complicated, I answered. Daniel nodded like he understood. Before leaving, he stopped near the patio steps. You know what scares me most? He said quietly. I waited. One day, I'm gonna wake up and realize I spent my entire life being useful to people who never really loved me. Then he left. I sat alone outside long after his truck disappeared. The propane heater clicked softly beside me. A flock of birds crossed the gray afternoon sky overhead in loose formation. And I kept hearing Daniel's voice repeating that final sentence. Being useful to people who never really loved me. There's a particular sorrow that arrives when your younger siblings unknowingly describe your own life back to you. That night, Claire called me for the first time. Not texted, called. I stared at the phone vibrating on the nightstand while Helen brushed her teeth in the bathroom. Her name glowed against the dark screen. I let it ring out. A minute later, another call came. Then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I waited until Helen fell asleep before listening to it downstairs in the dark kitchen. At first, there was only breathing. Then Claire's voice. Soft, shaking slightly. Daniel checked my phone tonight. My stomach tightened instantly. He thinks something's wrong, she whispered. I told him he was imagining things. A pause. Rain tapped faintly against the windows again. But he saw your name. Another pause. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. He asked if I was in love with you. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The voicemail continued. I didn't answer him fast enough. My chest felt suddenly heavy. Not panic. Something worse. The awful realization that consequences had finally begun moving on their own. I think he's starting to watch me now, Claire whispered. You need to talk to me before this gets worse. Then silence. The message ended. I stood motionless in the dark kitchen while the refrigerator hummed quietly nearby. Upstairs, Helen slept peacefully. And somewhere across town, my younger brother was probably lying awake beside a woman he no longer trusted, slowly realizing his marriage contained a stranger. The old brass clock ticked from the dining room. Steady, patient. Like time itself, watching everything finally begin to rot in the open. Then my phone vibrated one more time. A text from Claire. Only 4 words this time. He knows about us. And for the first time since this began, I understood something terrible. The truth no longer mattered. Only perception did. I didn't sleep at all that night. By 4 a.m, I was sitting alone in the garage workshop with the old radio humming softly beside me, while rainwater dripped from the gutters outside. The same room where Claire first crossed the line. Funny how certain places absorb emotional residue afterward. Even empty rooms begin feeling contaminated once memory stains them deeply enough. Her final message kept circling inside my head. He knows about us. Not he suspects. Not he's confused. About us. The deliberate wording mattered. Claire understood language too well to make accidental choices. I stared at my father's wristwatch lying motionless on the workbench. The cracked leather band. The scratched glass. A dead thing I still maintained out of loyalty. There was probably a lesson in that somewhere. Around 6:30, Helen came downstairs wearing her robe and found me in the kitchen making coffee. You never came to bed. Couldn't sleep. She studied me carefully while tying her hair back. You look pale. I almost laughed. After 32 years together, that was what concern sounded like now. Observations. Surface damage reports. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. Did something happen with Daniel? I looked up sharply. Why would you ask that? He texted me at 1 a.m. A cold sensation moved slowly through my stomach. What did he say? Helen hesitated. Then, he asked if Claire had ever talked about you. The kitchen suddenly felt too small. What did you tell him? The truth, she said carefully. That she admires you. Admire. Such an innocent word for something capable of destroying families. And? Helen wrapped both hands around her mug. And I told him he was being paranoid. I stared at her for several seconds. You really believe that? Her eyes narrowed slightly. What's that supposed to mean? There it was again. That dangerous distance between truth and performance. I no longer knew whether Helen genuinely misunderstood the situation or simply preferred misunderstanding because it protected the structure of our lives. You know Claire's been inappropriate with me, I said quietly. The sentence hung heavily between us. Helen looked away first. Not shocked, not confused, tired. That's not the same thing, she murmured. The response hit harder than denial would have, because it confirmed everything. She knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to classify it privately, to contain it emotionally instead of confronting it openly. How long? I asked. Helen frowned. How long what? How long have you known? For several seconds, only the coffee maker made noise. Finally, she sighed softly. Claire gets attached to people, emotionally. That's not an answer. She talks too much when she drinks sometimes. I felt anger stir for the first time since this began. Not explosive anger, the quieter kind. The kind built from realizing your dignity became a management issue instead of something worth defending. So your solution was what? I asked. Ignore it until she destroyed somebody's marriage? Helen's face hardened immediately. Don't talk like this is entirely her fault. I stared at my wife in disbelief. She pursued me, and you kept it secret. The sentence landed like a slap, because part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Silence creates shadows where suspicion grows. Still, you think I wanted this? No, Helen said quietly. I think you liked being wanted. The room went completely still. There are sentences people carry for the rest of their lives because of who says them. That became one of mine. I looked at her carefully, at the woman I built my entire adulthood beside. And suddenly I understood something devastating. Helen had not been ignoring Claire because she trusted me completely. She had been ignoring Claire because part of her believed all men eventually invite temptation somehow. Even me. Especially me. You really think that little of me? Helen rubbed tiredly at her forehead. I think lonely people do complicated things. The cruelty of aging isn't physical decline. It's discovering how differently the people you love interpreted your sacrifices than you did. I spent decades believing my restraint, loyalty, and discipline formed the moral backbone of this family. But sitting there in that gray kitchen light, listening to my wife quietly distribute blame onto me for another woman's obsession, I realized something painful. Good men are often only trusted until temptation becomes inconvenient. Helen's phone buzzed on the counter. Both of us looked down instinctively. Daniel. She answered immediately. Hey. A pause. Her expression changed almost at once. Sharp concern replacing exhaustion. Daniel, slow down. I felt my pulse quicken. She listened silently for several seconds. Then, no, I haven't talked to Robert yet. My chest tightened. Yet. Another pause. Helen glanced at me. Longer this time. Okay, she said softly into the phone. Just don't do anything stupid. Then she hung up. What happened? I asked. Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat slowly at the table across from me. He went through Claire's laptop last night. The air seemed to leave the room. And he found deleted messages. I felt suddenly cold. What messages? He didn't say exactly, but her eyes told me enough. She suspected. Maybe not certainty yet, but movement. Pieces beginning to connect. He thinks she's emotionally involved with someone, Helen continued quietly. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. And he thinks it's me. Helen didn't answer, which was answer enough. Outside, rain slid slowly down the windows while a garbage truck groaned somewhere down the street. Ordinary morning sounds. That was always the strange part of family collapse. The world keeps moving normally, while private disasters spread silently through kitchens and text messages and sleepless bedrooms. Finally, Helen spoke again. You need to talk to him. I looked up. And say what? The truth. I almost laughed. Which truth? That Claire pursued me? That Helen quietly knew? That none of us stopped it early enough? Truth becomes complicated once several people start surviving through partial versions of it. He won't believe me, I said. Helen looked down at her hands. He might. No confidence, no certainty, just possibility. That hurt too. I stood abruptly and walked toward the sink. I spent 32 years being loyal to this family. Helen's voice remained quiet behind me. I know. No, I said softly. You really don't. Silence filled the kitchen again. Then Helen said something I never expected to hear from her. You stopped letting anyone love you years ago, Robert. I turned slowly. What does that even mean? It means you became dependable instead of reachable. The words struck somewhere deep, because they contained enough truth to wound properly. You think I wanted to become that way? I asked. I think life made you tired, she whispered, and eventually, you started living like nobody could hurt you if you stopped needing anything. For one brief moment, I saw us clearly. Not villains, not victims, just two exhausted people who slowly abandoned intimacy while preserving marriage out of habit, fear, responsibility, and history. Maybe that was worse. The phone rang again. This time it was mine. Claire. Her name glowed against the screen between us like an exposed wire. Helen stared at it. I let it ring, then ring again, then stop. A message appeared instantly afterward. Daniel left the house. He took his wedding ring off before he walked out. My stomach dropped. Another message. I think everything's collapsing. Helen looked at me carefully. What did she say? I should have lied. Instead, maybe because exhaustion strips people raw eventually, I handed Helen the phone silently. She read the messages, and for the first time since this began, I watched genuine fear spread slowly across my wife's face. Not jealousy, not suspicion. Consequences. Real ones. The kind no family meeting or polite explanation fixes afterward. Helen handed the phone back carefully. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. She finally went too far. I looked down at Claire's messages again, and somewhere deep inside me, another realization formed slowly and terribly. No, she hadn't gone too far. Not yet. Because truly dangerous people don't panic when things collapse. They adapt. And I suddenly feared Claire was about to become much more dangerous than any of us understood. Daniel disappeared for almost 2 days. No calls, no texts, nothing. Helen tried reaching him repeatedly the first night, but every call went straight to voicemail. Claire claimed she didn't know where he went, though something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Too measured, too calm for a woman whose husband had just walked out after discovering emotional betrayal. That frightened me more than panic would have, because panic means people still fear consequences. Calm usually means preparation. By the second evening, the entire family could feel something breaking apart beneath the surface. Nathan called, asking why his uncle wasn't answering anyone. Eric texted Helen privately 3 times. Even my granddaughter Lily noticed tension during dinner when Helen barely touched her food. Families communicate emotionally long before they communicate honestly. That night, after Helen went upstairs early claiming a headache, I stayed alone in the dining room, staring at the old family photograph on the wall. The lake house picture, 12 years ago, before the invisible fractures became visible. I studied everyone's faces carefully. Daniel smiling with genuine ease, Helen leaning lightly against my shoulder, Eric holding his newborn daughter awkwardly, like fatherhood still surprised him, and Claire. Even then, she was looking at me instead of the camera. I'd never noticed before. Funny how memory rearranges itself after betrayal. Old moments become evidence retroactively. My phone buzzed softly against the table. Claire. I considered ignoring it, then answered. What? Her breathing trembled faintly through the speaker. I think he's staying at the Hampton near Route 8. You think? He used our joint credit card. I closed my eyes briefly. What do you want from me, Claire? Silence. Then, I need you to talk to him. The request stunned me. You created this. I know. No, I said quietly. I don't think you do. Rain tapped steadily against the windows again. It had rained nearly every day that week. The whole world outside looked waterlogged and gray. He won't listen to me anymore, she whispered. There it was. Fear. Real fear this time. Not manipulation, not performance. The first genuine crack I'd heard in her voice since any of this began. He asked if I loved you, she continued softly, and I couldn't answer him fast enough. My chest tightened painfully, because I understood the exact moment Daniel's heart must have broken. Not from certainty, from hesitation. Sometimes betrayal only takes 1 second of silence. What did you tell him afterward? That it wasn't like that. But Claire didn't answer. That was answer enough. I rubbed tiredly at my forehead. You need to tell him the truth. I don't even know what the truth is anymore. The sentence lingered heavily between us, and for the first time since this began, I heard something beneath Claire's manipulation that sounded frighteningly human. Confusion. Broken people often mistake emotional obsession for love because both things feel consuming from the inside. You crossed boundaries, I said carefully. Repeatedly. I know. You manipulated situations. Another silence, then, yes. And now your husband thinks his brother betrayed him. Her breathing shook again. I never meant for it to become this. That was probably true. People rarely intend emotional disasters in their final form. They nurture smaller selfishnesses, believing they can control the outcome later. By the time reality arrives, damage has usually outgrown intention. You need to stop contacting me, I told her. Please. The desperation in her voice made me feel suddenly exhausted beyond anger. What? If he asks you directly, she whispered, don't humiliate me. I stared into the dark dining room while the brass clock ticked softly overhead. There it was. Not remorse, not accountability. Image. Even now, part of her still prioritized survival over truth. You should be more worried about Daniel than yourself. I am. No, I said quietly. You're worried about losing how people see you. She started crying then. Actual crying. Not dramatic, not loud. Small, restrained sounds. And somehow that disturbed me more deeply than manipulation ever had. Because manipulative people crying always creates confusion. You begin remembering they're damaged human beings too, that they suffer genuinely, even while causing suffering. That complexity makes moral clarity much harder. My father cheated on my mother for 11 years, Claire whispered suddenly. Did you know that? I said nothing. She stayed anyway, pretended not to notice, smiled through holidays, family photos, church dinners. The rain outside intensified softly. And one day she told me something I never forgot. Claire's voice trembled. She said the loneliest people aren't abandoned. They're the ones forced to watch love die slowly while everyone keeps pretending it's alive. I leaned back heavily in the chair. Because despite everything, part of me understood exactly why that sentence haunted her. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked quietly. "You looked lonely before I ever touched you." The honesty of it hurt. Not because it justified anything, because it explained too much. I realized then that Claire hadn't chosen me randomly. She sensed emotional vacancy inside this family long before I admitted it existed myself. Predators notice starvation quickly because they carry it too. "You need help," I said softly. I needed someone to see me. The sentence sat between us like broken glass. Then headlights swept briefly across the front windows, a car pulling into the driveway. My stomach tightened instantly. I stood and looked through the curtains. Daniel's truck. He sat motionless behind the wheel for several seconds before shutting off the engine. Claire heard the silence shift through the phone. "What is it?" "He's here." Her breathing stopped completely. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let him hate me." Then the line disconnected. I stood frozen near the window while Daniel remained sitting outside in darkness beneath the rain. Something about his posture frightened me. Not rage, defeat. Men collapse quietly most of the time. That's what people fail to understand. We don't always explode when our lives break apart. Sometimes we just sit alone in parked vehicles, staring at rain-covered windshields, wondering where we disappeared inside our own existence. Finally, Daniel got out. He looked older than he had 48 hours earlier. His clothes were wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, wedding ring missing. I opened the front door before he knocked. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading since this began. "Did you sleep with my wife?" No anger, no shouting, just exhaustion. That made it infinitely worse. I looked at my younger brother standing soaked beneath the porch light. The boy I helped raise after our father died. The man who trusted me more consistently than almost anyone else in my life. And I realized something terrible in that moment. No answer I gave would fully save either of us anymore. "No," I said firmly. Daniel stared at me for several long seconds. Did she want to? The rain fell harder around us. I could hear Helen moving upstairs faintly, probably awake now, listening, waiting. I thought about lying again, protecting everyone again, preserving structure through silence again. But some moments arrive when truth becomes the last remaining form of dignity. "Yes," I answered quietly. Daniel closed his eyes, not dramatically, like a man physically absorbing impact. "When?" "For a while." "How long is a while?" "I don't know exactly." His jaw tightened painfully. "And you never told me." There it was. Not betrayal from sex. Betrayal from silence. The accusation hurt because it was deserved. I was trying to protect the family. Daniel laughed once. A terrible sound. That's what everybody says right before families fall apart. Neither of us moved. Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof between us. Then Daniel asked the question that finally hollowed me out completely. Did Helen know? I looked at him, and in that tiny hesitation before answering, my brother understood everything. Every hidden conversation, every avoided confrontation, every carefully managed silence. Daniel stepped backward slowly, like the truth itself had physically shoved him away from the house. Then he whispered, "You all knew." Not accusation anymore, realization. And suddenly, the porch light felt unbearably bright while rain drowned the world around us. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized he was right. Daniel walked away before I could stop him. Not quickly. That would have been easier to understand. He just turned slowly and stepped back into the rain, like a man leaving his own funeral. "Daniel." He raised one hand without looking at me. A small gesture, but final. Then he got back into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there long after the taillights disappeared. Rainwater soaked through my shirt while cold wind moved across the porch. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before falling silent again. Behind me, the front door creaked softly. "Helen." "You should come inside," she said quietly. I didn't move. "You heard everything?" "Yes." The word barely rose above the rain. I turned toward her slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 32 years together, and somehow we suddenly looked like strangers standing in the wreckage of a life neither of us understood anymore. "You knew," I said. Helen folded her arms tightly against herself. "I knew Claire fixated on you." "That's not the same thing." "No," she admitted softly. "It isn't." The honesty almost made it worse. I stepped inside finally and closed the door behind me. Water dripped quietly from my sleeves onto the hardwood floor. Helen watched me carefully. "You should have told him." I laughed bitterly. "So should you." That hit. I saw it immediately in her face. Not anger, shame. But shame inside long marriages becomes complicated. It rarely arrives cleanly. It tangles itself with exhaustion and self-defense and years of accumulated disappointment. "I thought it would pass," she whispered. "Why?" Helen looked down at the floor. "Because women like Claire eventually get bored." The sentence disturbed me deeply, not because it was cruel, because it revealed how long Helen had categorized Claire privately, understood her, managed her emotionally without ever confronting the damage directly. "How long has this been happening?" Helen hesitated too long. That frightened me. "How long?" I repeated. "A few years." The room tilted slightly. A few years. "She flirted sometimes," Helen said quickly. "Made comments, crossed lines when she drank too much." "And you never thought I deserved to know?" Her expression hardened suddenly. "You think I wanted to humiliate you?" There it was, the real answer. Not protection. Embarrassment. Families bury uncomfortable truths because exposure threatens identity more than morality. I stared at my wife while something inside me slowly shifted into place. All these years, I believed loyalty created safety. But loyalty without honesty just creates better hiding places. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me." Helen's eyes filled slightly. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you'd like it." The sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said. Because buried underneath all the silence and avoidance and emotional distance was insecurity. Helen stepped closer slowly. "You changed a long time ago, Robert." I said nothing. "You became quieter, harder to reach. Women notice things like that." I almost laughed again. The tragedy of marriage is how often two people suffer the exact same loneliness
while blaming each other for creating it. You think I became lonely because women stopped noticing me? No, Helen whispered. I think you became lonely because you stopped believing you deserved to be noticed. That one landed somewhere dangerous, because it felt true in ways I hated. There's a stage of fatherhood where men slowly disappear into function. Provider, solver,
Stabilizer, emergency contact, financial structure, useful things, necessary things, but not deeply seen things. And if enough years pass that way, eventually even you stop expecting tenderness anymore. Helen looked exhausted standing there beneath the dim kitchen light. Older, not physically, emotionally. I didn't think she'd go this far, she murmured. She took pictures of me in the garage. Helen's face drained instantly. What? I told her. Not everything, but enough. The messages, the manipulation, the threats hidden beneath implication. Helen sat down slowly at the table, like her knees weakened beneath her. She said you refused her, she whispered. Yes. And she kept pushing? Yes. For several seconds, the only sound came from rain against the windows. Then Helen covered her mouth with one trembling hand. My God. It should have felt satisfying. Vindication. Instead, I just felt tired. Because recognition arriving late still leaves damage behind. She could have destroyed everything, Helen said quietly. I looked at her. She still can. That silence afterward felt enormous. Then Helen asked the question I'd secretly feared most. Did any part of you want it? The honesty of it stunned me. Not accusatory, human. I thought carefully before answering. There's a difference between wanting a person and wanting to feel wanted. Helen looked down immediately, because she understood. Of course she did. That was the awful thing. We had spent years starving quietly beside each other while pretending maturity meant needing less emotionally. I never touched her, I said softly. Helen nodded faintly. But? I stared at the rain-dark window over the sink. But I liked remembering I was still visible to somebody. The confession sat heavily between us. Not infidelity, not innocence either. Just human weakness spoken aloud too late. Helen's eyes filled again, though she didn't cry. You never told me you felt invisible. You never asked. That hurt both of us equally. Around midnight, Nathan called. He sounded anxious immediately. What happened with Uncle Daniel? I closed my eyes briefly. Why? He showed up at Eric's house drunk. My stomach tightened. Daniel barely drank. How bad? Not violent or anything, Nathan said quickly. Just messed up. I looked at Helen across the kitchen. She already knew from my face. What did he say? I asked quietly. Nathan hesitated. Then, he said the family's been lying to him for years. The sentence spread through the room like smoke. Is Eric there? Yeah. Put him on. A muffled exchange followed. Then Eric came on the line, sounding irritated already. You need to fix this. Not hello. Not concern. Fix this. There it was again. My role in the family reduced instantly to structural repair. What exactly do you think happened? I asked. Eric exhaled sharply.
I don't know, Dad, but Uncle Daniel's saying weird things about Claire and Mom covering stuff up. Helen flinched slightly beside me. He's upset. He's drunk, Eric snapped. And now Melissa's asking questions. Of course she was. Families spread panic horizontally. One crack becomes 10 within hours. I'll talk to him tomorrow, I said. You better, Eric muttered, because Lily heard him yelling in the driveway. The line disconnected. I stared at the darkened phone screen. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, Helen began crying. Quietly at first, then harder. Not dramatic sobbing, the exhausted kind. The kind people do after holding emotional weight too long. I ruined everything, she whispered. I looked at my wife, sitting beneath dim kitchen light with tears running silently down her face. And despite everything, I still felt protective of her. That's the terrible thing about long love. Even damaged love.
It survives places dignity sometimes cannot. You didn't ruin everything alone, I said quietly. Helen shook her head. You don't understand. Something in her voice changed. Fear again. Real fear. I felt my chest tighten. What aren't you telling me? She looked up slowly, and in that moment, before she even spoke, I knew whatever came next would make this worse. Much worse. Helen wiped at her eyes shakily, then whispered, Claire wasn't the only one who noticed you changing. The room went completely still, and for the first time in 32 years of marriage, I became afraid of what my wife might say next. I stared at Helen for several seconds without speaking. The rain outside had softened into a faint, steady drizzle now, tapping lightly against the windows like fingers testing glass. What does that mean? Helen looked suddenly older sitting there beneath the kitchen light. Not weak. Just worn down by years she could no longer organize neatly inside herself. She rubbed her palms together nervously before answering. About 6 years ago, she said quietly, Marianne asked me if we were having problems. I frowned. Why would she ask that? Helen gave a small, humorless laugh. Because apparently you looked miserable. The sentence shouldn't have hurt, but it did. There's something uniquely painful about discovering your loneliness was visible publicly before it became discussable privately. She said you looked emotionally absent, Helen continued. Like a man walking around inside his own life instead of living it. I leaned back slowly against the counter. And I defended you. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. That meant she'd rehearsed it before. But rehearsal usually hides unfinished guilt. Helen. She looked down immediately. She told me you deserved better than the way this family treated you sometimes. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. Because Marianne had noticed something nobody inside the family ever acknowledged openly. I carried more than everyone else. Financially, emotionally, practically, quietly. Not heroically, just consistently. That becomes dangerous after enough years. Families slowly start organizing themselves around the assumption that one person will always absorb pressure silently. What does this have to do with Claire? Helen hesitated again. Then, Marianne said women notice men like you. I felt exhaustion spread through me instantly. Not jealousy, not scandal, just deep tiredness. You think this is flattering? No, Helen whispered. I think it frightened me. Finally, honesty. I stayed quiet while she continued. You stopped needing me years ago, Robert. That's not true.
Yes, she said softly. It is.
I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. Because maybe she was right in ways neither of us fully understood. There's a stage in long marriages where disappointment becomes adaptation. You stop reaching for things that never arrive. Stop explaining emotional needs that feel burdensome. Stop asking to be seen because repeated invisibility eventually trains people into silence. Maybe I had stopped needing Helen. Or maybe I just stopped believing needing anyone was safe. You withdrew from everyone, she murmured. Not just me. I looked toward the dark dining room, at the family photograph still hanging beneath the brass clock. You think that happened for no reason? Helen's face tightened slightly. No. There it was again. That wordless acknowledgement that my exhaustion didn't emerge in isolation. She knew. Maybe not consciously at first, but somewhere over the years, Helen understood this family consumed me more than it loved me. And still nothing changed. That realization sat heavily between us. Then Helen said quietly, "Claire noticed before I did." I looked at her sharply. "She told me once you seemed lonely at family dinners." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Of course she did. "No," Helen said carefully. "You don't understand." I waited. "She said you looked like a man everyone depended on, but nobody really listened to." The accuracy of it hollowed something inside me. Not because Claire was wise, because observation without empathy becomes predation. She saw the wound clearly enough to exploit it. That's different from caring. You should have stopped her. I tried. How? Helen looked ashamed again. I told her she was projecting her own unhappiness onto you. And? She said unhappy people recognize each other faster. The kitchen fell silent. God, that sounded exactly like Claire. Emotionally perceptive in ways that felt intimate right until you realized she weaponized insight instead of respecting it. I suddenly remembered dozens of tiny moments differently. Claire refilling my coffee before asking anyone else. Remembering details Helen forgot. Listening when I spoke instead of waiting to interrupt. Small things, but emotionally starved people notice small kindnesses with dangerous intensity. That's how boundaries erode quietly. Not through grand passion, through recognition. Helen stood slowly and moved toward the sink beside me. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked softly. I didn't answer. "I think part of me was relieved somebody still saw you." I turned toward her, and for the first time in years, my wife looked directly into me instead of around me. "I was tired too, Robert." The confession changed something, because until then, I'd secretly framed myself as the sole emotional laborer in this marriage. But exhaustion corrodes both people eventually, just differently. "I spent years watching this family take pieces from you," Helen whispered. "Money, time, stability, patience." Her eyes filled again. "And every time I tried talking about it, you defended them." That hit hard because it was true. I had protected everyone constantly. My sons from consequences, Daniel from failure, Helen from conflict, even Claire eventually. Not out of weakness, out of identity. I didn't know who I was outside usefulness anymore. "Some people confuse unconditional love with permanent access," I murmured. Helen looked at me carefully. "Where'd you hear that?" "I think I've known it a long time." The old brass clock ticked steadily behind us. Tick, tick, tick. Time measuring damage. Then Helen whispered something that finally connected pieces I hadn't understood before. "Claire envied me." I frowned. "Why?" "Because you stayed loyal." The sentence landed strangely. Not pride, grief. Helen laughed softly through tears. "Do you know how many women complained about their husbands over the years? Affairs, pornography, secret debt, emotional affairs online." I said nothing. And every time, I got to say, my husband would never do that. A terrible realization moved slowly through me. This had become part of Helen's identity too. My reliability, my restraint, my steadiness. She depended on it emotionally the same way everyone else depended on me practically. "I think Claire hated that," Helen said quietly. "Not because she wanted you originally, but because she couldn't understand how someone like you still existed." I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded painfully plausible. Manipulative people often become obsessed with integrity because it exposes their own fragmentation. "She wanted proof," I murmured. Helen nodded slowly. "Yes. Proof that loyalty eventually cracks. Proof that restraint is temporary. Proof that all marriages secretly rock the same way hers did." The realization made me feel suddenly cold, because if that was true, then this had never been about romance. It was conquest. Emotional vandalism disguised as longing. The phone buzzed again. This time, Helen and I both flinched, but it wasn't Claire. It was Eric. A text. "Uncle Daniel says he knows about Mom." My stomach dropped instantly. Helen grabbed the phone from my hand. Her face drained of color as she read further. "What?" I asked sharply. She looked physically ill now. "What did he say?" Helen swallowed hard, then handed me the phone silently. Another message from Eric waited beneath the first. "He says Mom emotionally cheated on Dad years ago, and that's why she protected Claire." The room tilted. I stared at the screen while something ancient and terrible cracked open inside my chest. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Helen didn't answer. That frightened me more than denial ever could have. I looked up slowly. "Helen." Her eyes filled instantly, and suddenly I understood. Not the details, not yet, but enough. Enough to realize my wife had been carrying another secret underneath all the others. One old enough to rot quietly beneath decades of marriage. One dangerous enough that Daniel somehow knew pieces of it. "Helen," I repeated. She covered her mouth, trembling, then finally whispered, "It wasn't physical." The sentence hit like a bullet anyway, because innocent people rarely start explanations there. Outside, thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the rain-dark sky. And standing there in that dim kitchen after 32 years of marriage, I realized my family wasn't collapsing because of Claire. Claire had only pulled loose a corner of something already rotten underneath. For several seconds, I couldn't hear anything except the clock. Tick, tick, tick. The sound seemed louder suddenly, sharper, like something counting down toward impact. Helen stood across from me with tears gathering in her eyes while the phone remained cold in my hand. "It wasn't physical." Funny how betrayal always arrives wrapped in technicalities first. I looked at her carefully. 32 years. A lifetime. And somehow I realized there were entire emotional landscapes inside my wife I had never truly walked through. "Who?" I asked quietly. Helen closed her eyes. "Robert." "Who?" The firmness in my voice startled both of us. Not anger. Worse. Clarity. She leaned heavily against the counter before answering. "His name was Andrew." The name meant nothing to me. That almost hurt more, because it proved how thoroughly hidden this had remained. "When?" Helen swallowed hard. "About 9 years ago." 9 years. I tried placing myself back there mentally. Nathan still in college. Eric going through his first separation with Melissa. My mother dying slowly from kidney failure. I had been working 60-hour weeks then, barely sleeping, constantly fixing problems. And somewhere, inside that exhausting blur of responsibility, my wife found emotional refuge with another man. How long? A few months. The kitchen suddenly felt unfamiliar, like walking through a replica of your own home built slightly wrong. What kind of emotional affair? Helen laughed bitterly through tears. That's such a pathetic phrase. No, I said quietly. Pathetic is hiding it for almost a decade. That landed. I watched shame move visibly across her face. We talked, she whispered. That's all. I said nothing. About marriage, loneliness, feeling invisible. The irony nearly suffocated me. You mean the exact things we never discussed with each other? Helen nodded once, a tiny broken movement. Yes. I looked away toward the rain-dark window. There are moments in life where anger would feel easier than grief. Cleaner, simpler. But sitting there listening to my wife describe emotional intimacy with another man from nearly 10 years earlier, all I felt was profound exhaustion. Not because betrayal didn't matter, because part of me understood exactly how it happened. That terrified me most. How'd it end? Helen wiped at her eyes shakily. He moved away. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because of course it ended passively, quietly, like most emotional affairs do. Not with dramatic passion, but circumstance. A connection formed in loneliness, sustained through emotional hunger, then buried beneath routine once reality interrupted. Did you love him? The question came out calmer than I expected. Helen looked genuinely horrified. No. Too fast, too emotional, which meant yes. Maybe not completely, maybe not permanently, but enough. How far did it go? We never touched each other. Again with the technicalities. I sat slowly at the table across from her. Did you want to? Helen's silence answered before words did. God. At 59 years old, I discovered my marriage contained ghosts. Invisible people standing silently between old memories. I suddenly wondered how many dinners Helen spent texting him while I paid bills in the next room. How many mornings she carried someone else emotionally while sleeping beside me physically. And worst of all, whether I noticed something was wrong back then and simply ignored it because responsibility left no room for emotional investigation. Did Daniel know? Helen nodded faintly. My stomach turned cold instantly. How? He saw messages once. And? He confronted me privately. I stared at her in disbelief. And never told me. He said it wasn't his place.
The hypocrisy of it nearly made me laugh again. All of us protecting each other through silence while relationships quietly decayed underneath. Families are strange that way.
People mistake secrecy for mercy until hidden things grow sharp enough to cut everyone.
He hated Andrew, Helen whispered. Said the man looked at me too much during gatherings.
The room spun slightly. Gatherings, meaning I'd met him. Shaken his hand probably, shared drinks, maybe even thanked him for helping move furniture or bringing wine to dinner. Men always imagine betrayal arriving dramatically, but usually it sits smiling across barbecue grills while you refill its glass. When did Claire find out? Helen looked away immediately. That told me enough already.
Helen, about 4 years ago.
Of course she knew. Claire collected vulnerabilities the way some people collect debts, quietly cataloging weaknesses inside others for future leverage.
She promised never to tell anyone, Helen murmured. I stared at my wife. And you trusted her? She understood what loneliness does to people.
No, I said softly. She understood what shame does to people. That was different. Very different. Suddenly, everything rearranged itself in my head. Helen protecting Claire. Claire pushing boundaries with confidence. Daniel sensing emotional dishonesty long before he understood its shape. It was all connected by silence. Years and years of silence. You should have told me. Helen began crying harder then.
I know.
No, I whispered. I don't think you do. Because the affair itself hurt less than the realization beneath it. My wife believed emotional starvation inside our marriage was easier to survive privately than confront honestly with me. And maybe she was right. That possibility hollowed me out. The phone buzzed again. Claire. This time she called Helen directly. Helen stared at the screen without moving. Answer it, I said. She looked terrified.
Robert.
Answer it. Helen picked up slowly.
Hello?
Claire sounded frantic immediately, loud enough I could hear pieces from across the table.
Daniel told Eric everything.
Helen closed her eyes. I know.
He said I manipulated him for years.
A pause. Then Claire's voice cracked completely.
He called me my mother.
The sentence lingered heavily in the kitchen, because pain always sounds most human when it accidentally reveals old wounds.
What happened?
Helen asked softly.
He came home drunk, Claire whispered. Started going through drawers, looking at old photos, asking questions about you and Andrew.
I felt my pulse stop briefly. Claire continued crying softly through the phone.
He said this family turns loneliness into inheritance.
My chest tightened painfully. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Too observant when wounded. Too emotionally intelligent for his own survival.
Where is he now?
Helen asked.
I don't know.
A long silence followed. Then Claire asked the question that changed everything again.
Does Robert hate me?
Helen looked at me, waiting. I realized then that everyone in this family had quietly organized their emotional lives around my reactions. My steadiness, my restraint, my forgiveness. Not because they respected it fully, because they relied on it. I felt suddenly ancient.
He's hurt,
Helen answered carefully. Claire started crying harder.
I never wanted to destroy anything.
I stood abruptly and walked toward the sink. That sentence again. As though destruction only counts once consequences become visible.
You need to tell Daniel everything, Helen said quietly into the phone. I can't. Yes, Helen whispered. You can. No, you don't understand. Something changed in Claire's voice then. Fear. Real terror. I think he went to see Andrew. The room froze completely. I turned around slowly. Helen's face drained white. What? He found his name, Claire whispered.
Old messages? I don't know. My stomach dropped. Andrew, a man from nearly a decade ago, suddenly dragged back into the center of our family collapse. You need to call Daniel, Helen said sharply. He won't answer me. I grabbed my keys from the counter immediately. Helen looked at me in shock. Where are you going? To find my brother. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Thunder rolled again somewhere distant. And standing there near the doorway, looking at my wife's frightened face after uncovering nearly 10 years of buried emotional betrayal, I realized something devastating. I no longer knew whether I was trying to save my family or simply survive learning who they really were. I found Daniel's truck outside a bar 20 minutes from Andrew's neighborhood. That detail mattered later. At the time, all I felt was relief sharp enough to weaken my knees slightly. Rain flooded the parking lot beneath pale yellow streetlights, while neon signs flickered weakly against the storm-dark night. The place looked nearly empty, except for 2 pickup trucks and a motorcycle parked near the entrance. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at Daniel's windshield streaked with rainwater. Then I noticed something on the passenger seat. A photograph. Even through the wet glass, I recognized it instantly. The lake house picture. The family photo from 12 years earlier. Something about that disturbed me deeply. People don't carry old family photographs around during emotional collapse unless they're searching for proof of something. Or mourning it. Inside, the bar smelled like wet jackets, stale beer, and fryer grease. Country music played softly from an old jukebox near the back wall. Daniel sat alone in a booth beneath a television showing muted football highlights. 3 empty glasses in front of him, wedding ring beside them. He looked up when I approached. No surprise in his face, only exhaustion. I figured you'd come eventually, he said quietly. I slid into the booth across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The bartender wiped glasses behind the counter without looking our direction. Outside, rain hammered steadily against the windows. You drove to Andrew's neighborhood? I asked finally. Daniel stared down at the ring beside his hand. I wanted to see what kind of man he was. And he died 2 years ago. That stunned me. Daniel laughed bitterly. Funny, right? Not funny, but cruel in the specific way life often is. The man had already vanished from the world, yet somehow still managed to stand between Helen and me all these years later. How'd you find out? I sat outside his old house like a lunatic for 40 minutes until some woman walking a dog told me. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. Brain aneurysm, apparently. Just dropped dead in his kitchen one morning. The randomness of it hollowed something inside me. All those hidden emotions, secrets, attachments, years of quiet guilt. And the man himself simply gone, reduced to neighborhood trivia. Did you talk to Claire? I asked. Daniel laughed once, a dry, broken sound. She cried. And? She said she didn't know why she became obsessed with you. The word landed heavily. Obsessed. Finally, somebody said it plainly. I leaned back slowly in the booth.
Daniel stared at me carefully. She really did want you, didn't she? I answered honestly. Yes. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. You know what's strange? I waited. I'm not even angry you rejected her. That hurt more than accusation would have. I'm angry nobody trusted me enough to tell me the truth. There it was again. Not betrayal from desire, betrayal from silence. Families don't usually collapse because of single events.
They collapse because people keep choosing emotional convenience over difficult honesty, until trust dies quietly underneath everything else. You're right, I said softly. Daniel looked up sharply. What? You're right. The words tasted heavy. I should have told you immediately. Rain rattled violently against the windows. Daniel stared at me for several seconds before nodding once. Not forgiveness, recognition. I think Mom's death broke you more than anybody noticed, he said suddenly. The change in subject startled me. What? 9 years ago, he murmured. Right around when Helen started talking to Andrew. I looked down at the table. My mother's illness had hollowed that entire year apart. Hospital visits before work, financial stress, sleepless nights. Watching a woman who once terrified every room she entered slowly forget her own address. And through all of it, I kept functioning. That was my role. Keep functioning. After she died, Daniel continued quietly, you stopped talking about anything real. The sentence landed hard because it felt painfully accurate. Grief changes men differently than people expect. Sometimes it doesn't make us emotional. Sometimes it makes us unavailable. I stared toward the rain-dark parking lot beyond the bar windows. You ever get tired of being everyone's stable thing? Daniel asked softly. God, that question. Again. I rubbed tiredly at my jaw. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly like he'd expected no other answer. Claire used to say you carried this family like a second job. The irony almost made me sick. She noticed because she was studying weaknesses. No, Daniel said quietly. I think she noticed because nobody else did. I looked at him sharply. He met my eyes steadily. You think she's evil because that's easier than admitting she understood something true. I almost argued, then stopped. Because somewhere underneath all the manipulation and obsession and emotional vandalism, Claire had recognized my loneliness correctly. She just chose to weaponize recognition instead of respecting it. That difference mattered enormously. Still, you deserved better than this, Daniel said quietly. The sentence hit me harder than any accusation all week, because nobody had said that to me in years. Not Helen, not my sons, nobody. Men become dangerous to themselves once they stop believing they deserve care too. I suddenly realized how close I'd come emotionally to needing Claire's attention simply because it acknowledged my existence. That terrified me more than temptation itself. The bartender brought Daniel another drink. I moved it aside before he could touch it. You've had enough. Daniel didn't argue, just stared at the untouched glass. You know what the worst part is? He asked softly. What? I still love her. There it was. The humiliation people rarely admit aloud after betrayal. Love surviving beyond dignity. I understood it instantly because despite everything, part of me still loved Helen too. Not blindly anymore, not innocently. but deeply enough that the pain remained structural instead of temporary. "She's broken," Daniel whispered. "Yes. So is Helen." I said nothing. "And maybe," he continued quietly, "so are we." That one stayed between us for a while, because middle-aged men rarely discuss emotional damage honestly. We usually translate pain into work hours, drinking, isolation, heart attacks. Anything except confession. Finally, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and slid his phone across the table toward me. "Look." I picked it up carefully. A screenshot filled the screen. An old message thread between Claire and Helen. Years old, judging by the date. Claire. "Do you ever worry he'll realize how much of himself this family consumes?" Helen. "He already knows." Claire. "Then why does he stay?" Several minutes passed before Helen's reply. "Because leaving would destroy everyone." My chest tightened painfully. I kept reading. Claire. "That's not love. That's captivity." Helen. "Maybe after enough years there's no difference." I handed the phone back slowly. The rain outside softened slightly. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Daniel asked quietly, "Do you think they're right?" The question hollowed me out completely, because I didn't know anymore. Had I stayed out of love, duty, fear, identity, habit? At what point does sacrifice stop being noble and start becoming self-erasure? "I don't know," I admitted. Daniel nodded faintly. Then he looked toward the old family photograph sitting on the passenger seat of his truck outside. "You know why I brought that picture tonight?" I waited. "Because I kept staring at your face in it." A pause. "You looked exhausted even then." The sentence hit somewhere deep, because suddenly I remembered that trip clearly. Paying for the lake house after Eric lost money gambling again. Fixing plumbing the first night we arrived. Cooking breakfast every morning while everyone else slept late. Smiling through fatigue because fathers are supposed to turn exhaustion into atmosphere. And somewhere during all of it, Claire watching me. Helen drifting emotionally elsewhere. Daniel trying desperately to preserve a marriage already quietly starving him. The photograph hadn't captured a happy family. It captured the exact moment we all started disappearing inside ourselves. Then Daniel asked the question I feared most. "What happens now?" I looked at my younger brother sitting across from me beneath dim bar light while rain washed the world outside clean and cold. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had absolutely no idea how to hold my family together anymore. Daniel slept in my guest room that night, not because he asked, because neither of us trusted him to be alone. There's a particular emptiness to middle-aged heartbreak that younger people rarely understand. It doesn't explode outward dramatically most of the time. It hollows inward, quietly, like termites inside support beams. By the time we got home, the rain had finally stopped. The neighborhood looked washed pale beneath streetlights, while cold wind moved dead leaves across driveways and sidewalks. Helen was waiting in the kitchen when we walked in, still awake, still wearing the same sweater from earlier. Her eyes moved immediately to Daniel's face, then to the missing wedding ring. Something in her expression collapsed. "I'm fine," Daniel muttered before she could speak. Nobody believed him. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it shakily with water. For several seconds, the three of us stood there beneath the dim kitchen light, looking like survivors of some invisible accident. Then Daniel asked quietly, Did you love him? Straight to Helen. No build-up, no anger, just exhaustion demanding truth. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Yes. The honesty stunned all of us, including her. You could see it immediately after the word left her mouth, like she hadn't planned to say it aloud until suddenly she couldn't carry the weight another second. Daniel looked down slowly. Not shocked, just saddened in a way that seemed older than either of us. How long? I don't know, Helen whispered. Not forever, but long enough. She nodded once. I stood completely still near the sink while 20 years of marriage rearranged themselves in my memory. Not fake. That would have been easier. Just incomplete. There's a terrible maturity that arrives when you realize people can genuinely love you while still emotionally abandoning parts of your marriage. Human beings fracture before they betray. The betrayal is usually just the visible part. I never touched him, Helen said again softly. Daniel laughed bitterly. You still think that matters most? The sentence landed heavily because it was true. People cling to technical innocence when emotional honesty feels unbearable. Daniel looked toward me. Did you know? No. He nodded faintly. I believe you. God, that nearly broke me. Not because he trusted me, because trust had become rare enough to feel shocking. Helen sat slowly at the table, looking smaller somehow. When your mother died, she whispered to me, you disappeared emotionally for almost 2 years. I said nothing, because maybe she was right. Grief had turned me into machinery back then. Work, bills, funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork. Supporting everyone else, while quietly shutting down inside myself. Andrew apparently entered during that silence. He listened, Helen murmured. Not defensive, just honest. And somehow, honesty hurt worse now. I thought about all the nights during that period when I came home exhausted from overtime shifts to find Helen already asleep on the couch. All the conversations we never finished because one of us was too tired. All the grief we survived separately while sleeping beside each other. Loneliness grows fastest inside marriages where both people think protecting the other means hiding their own suffering. Daniel sat down heavily across from her. Why didn't you leave him? The question startled me. Not, why did you do it? Why stay? Helen looked at me then, long and quietly. Because I loved him more. The room fell silent, and for the first time all night, I believed her completely. That was the tragedy. Andrew hadn't replaced me. He'd filled absence temporarily, a substitute for intimacy, during years when exhaustion consumed our marriage faster than either of us admitted. That didn't excuse anything. But understanding and forgiveness are different things entirely. You should have told me, I whispered. Helen's eyes filled again. I was ashamed. No excuses left now, just shame. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. You know what's insane? He murmured. I think Claire knew exactly how vulnerable this whole family was emotionally before any of us did. I looked at him carefully. He continued staring into his water glass. She used to tell me your family survives through avoidance. A cold feeling moved through my chest, because that sounded painfully accurate. Avoid conflict, avoid confrontation, avoid difficult truths. Preserve appearances, keep functioning. Generation after generation. My father did the same thing after my mother's affairs in the 70s. Everyone knew. Nobody spoke. We inherited silence like furniture. You know what manipulative people understand better than anyone? Daniel asked quietly. I waited. They know exactly which truths everyone's already trying not to say. The kitchen grew very still. Then footsteps sounded softly on the stairs. Nathan, half asleep. What's going on? He stopped immediately after seeing our faces. Fear spread across his expression. At 28, he suddenly looked 12 again. Jesus, he whispered. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Daniel stood slowly. Your family's finally telling the truth, he said. Nathan looked between all of us, then at me, because that's what everyone always did eventually. Looked at me to stabilize the room, fix the atmosphere, contain the emotional leak. I realized then how exhausted I was of being everyone's emotional infrastructure. There's coffee in the pot, I said quietly, and I walked out of the kitchen. Nobody followed me. That surprised me more than anything else. I sat alone in the garage workshop afterward with the lights off. Just darkness. The faint smell of sawdust and machine oil. My father's dead wristwatch resting on the bench beside me. I picked it up carefully. The glass felt cold against my thumb. My father stayed married to my mother despite years of betrayal because he believed endurance made him honorable. I spent most of my life admiring that. Now I wasn't sure anymore. Sometimes people confuse self-erasure with loyalty because both require suffering quietly. The door creaked softly behind me. Helen. She didn't turn on the light, just stood near the entrance while cold air drifted faintly through the room. I'm sorry, she whispered. I kept staring at the watch. For what part? The question lingered heavily. Then Helen answered with devastating honesty. For learning how to live without you emotionally, instead of fighting for you properly. That one pierced straight through me. Because beneath all the lies and secrecy and failures, there it was, the real tragedy. Not that she found someone else briefly, that somewhere along the way, both of us stopped believing our marriage could still be repaired honestly. You think this family needs me, I said quietly. Helen didn't answer. But I think maybe they just got used to me carrying things. Silence. Then, you taught them to. I closed my eyes. God, she was right again. Every financial rescue, every emotional cleanup, every sacrifice performed quietly without complaint. I had trained everyone around me to depend on my endurance instead of respecting my limits. The realization felt humiliating and freeing. Helen stepped closer slowly. I don't know how to fix this. I finally looked at her. At the woman beside whom I'd spent more than half my life. A woman who betrayed me emotionally years ago, yet still looked at me now with genuine grief and love tangled hopelessly together. Some wounds don't destroy love. They reveal how damaged it already was. I don't think this gets fixed, I said softly. Helen flinched, and for the first time since any of this began, I saw genuine fear of losing me completely. Not as husband, as foundation. That distinction mattered more than she understood. Then my phone buzzed on the workbench beside the dead wristwatch. Claire. One new message. Only one sentence. Daniel told me everything about Andrew. I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived immediately after. I finally understand why you looked so lonely all these years. And reading those words in the darkness of my workshop, I felt something inside me begin quietly hardening into distance. Rain started again just before dawn. Not heavy this time. Just the thin, steady tapping against the garage roof while the neighborhood slept in darkness. I sat there alone for almost an hour after Claire's message, staring at my father's wristwatch beside the phone. Two broken things resting next to each other. And somewhere during that silence, I finally understood something that changed the shape of my entire life. I had spent decades confusing being needed with being loved. The difference between those two things is small when you're young. By the time you notice it clearly, most of your life is already gone. Inside the house, I could hear faint movement upstairs, pipes groaning softly, floorboards shifting beneath tired feet. My family waking slowly inside a structure I had held together so long they mistook its stability for permanence. But permanence is a dangerous illusion, especially when built on one exhausted man refusing to collapse. I picked up the wristwatch carefully and turned the crown once out of habit. Nothing. Still dead. Then I looked down at Claire's final message again. I finally understand why you looked so lonely all these years. And suddenly, I realized she was wrong. I had never truly been lonely. Lonely people are unseen. I had been seen constantly, watched, needed, measured, relied upon. What I actually was consumed. That realization settled into me with terrifying calm. Not rage, not heartbreak. Clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking about how to save my marriage, or repair my family, or protect everyone from consequences. Instead, I stood slowly in the darkness, walked to the old breaker panel near the workshop door, and shut off the power to the entire house. Upstairs, I heard startled voices immediately. Nathan, Helen. Doors opening, confusion spreading room to room. But I stayed motionless beside the silent panel while the house went completely dark around them. And for the first time in decades, they finally understood what it felt like when I stopped holding everything together.